Welcome, welcome, welcome. Dr. Jason Dean, BRAVEtv, your source for health, freedom, and knowledge. And it's been 2 days of I had to step away from the internet because one, the left is going ballistic, and two, the memes are comical beyond all belief. But we are back, and I have a very special guest, someone who hasn't been on in a long time, and I'm super excited. And we've been trying to connect up the last couple months or so, and just been crazy. So many of you have met before. He is one of my. I have three money mentors in my life. One is passed on, which was this person's very close friend. The other one is Ron Paul, and then I have Fred Dashevsky from US Coin Capital. What's up, buddy?
Hey, good day. Good to see you.
Do you know the name Vicky Southern?
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So I met her, my gosh, a year ago, maybe. We were doing there was a show being filmed, and we were kind of part of that with businesses. And then she reached out to me the other day because we talked off and on, and she brought your name up, and I was like, "You know Fred?" He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Oh my gosh!" And then she brought up Andy's name. I'm like, "Whoa, this is like a blast from the past." It was kind of funny.
Well, you remember, of course, Patrick, whose birthday would have been today.
Is it today?
Recently. Yeah. The weird thing is sometimes, Facebook posts people who've passed and they tell you it's their birthday. It's like they haven't caught up to the idea these people are no longer around. But
right.
Yeah, so today would have been Patrick's birthday, and Vicky was working with the PR group, and originally as Andy was getting booked on the various stations, I believe it was her PR group that originally connected Andy with Patrick.
No way.
So that back like 15, 18 years or so.
That is how I stumbled into you. I mean, Ron Paul was what kind of flipped me on money because of the Fed and learning what that was, and I became, staunchly, essentially libertarian. Even though I'm a Trump supporter for this. Even though I, head on a swivel, but I got my grandfather used to listen to Rush Limbaugh every day, but money wise, it was. I stumbled on Patrick somehow, like we're talking well over a decade ago. And I stumbled on a show with Andy, and Andy just made sense. And then he talked about Ron Paul, and he talked about conservatism, and like I was already in the conservative world. And then he had passed, and I was like, I never met him, talked to him, whatever, mortified. And then this Fred guy comes on. I'm like, well, let me listen to Fred because he was with Andy, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Fred gets it too, and here we are.
Ron Paul was a godsend to us when we were young in the business. We were feeling like we were standing against the wind, and it was so controversial, the concepts that we were trying to get our heads wrapped around as we began to uncover more about money and how convoluted the whole process was and how different it was than it was supposed to be. And, it became one of these things where language started to change, and it became much more complicated and difficult to understand it because I think they really attempted to dilute the ability of the average person to get it so that they could get away with things that were going to become a bigger problem, and they could explain their way out of it. And then comes a guy like Ron Paul, who was in Congress, and he would just stand up and rip through all of the fabric of crap and boil it down to basics, and was espousing the same things that we had independently come to understand on our own. And to hear somebody else say it, just saying the words coming out of somebody else, it was like, a little convincing that we weren't really off the beaten path that
right.
far.
Maybe we were crazy. Oh, wait, we're not crazy. There is somebody else who looks this way.
And he had studied it and was on the inside, and it was somebody. And I would listen to the way that the other congressmen, and when he would confront the Federal Reserve chairmen at the time, he would just grill them to the point you could see how uncomfortable it was for them. And then we really began to get it, that we were on the right track, and that, if it was this uncomfortable for them to have to face what Ron Paul was espousing, we knew that this was the truth, and we knew that this was going to hold up. And if you look back, I mean, there are so many now. The wonderful thing about the internet is the availability of the video clips from Ron Paul going back to like the 90s. You just pull any one of those up.
They're like popular again with the 20 and 30-year-olds. Like people are pulling up these videos from the 80s and I mean maybe some from the 70s. And like it's almost strange watching these younger generations like listen to this guy. And I'm like, we knew this guy like a long time ago.
So, what I have to think about is when you think about the 80s at 2024, where we are now, we're talking 40, 45 years. So it's been long enough to where, people don't remember the original resource. So it's almost as if it has to be relearned. And
Sure.
It's encouraging that the younger people are finding this stuff that, was so ingrained, in our knowledge, because I've always found that we kind of build upon the body of knowledge we have. And, hopefully people add to that. And I find myself like in two facets. One, relearning a lot of historical stuff, and the other is to go back and learn new stuff. So, finding these two things, it's interesting that you have to sometimes go back and you forget how long it's been since some of these things were part of what ingrained us to begin this trail. And it's really encouraging that the younger generation is read this. It's like when they find 80s music, there was some great stuff out there you guys never heard of. It's amazing that how do they not know this? How do they, not have that as a body of knowledge for, what impacts them on the modern world?
Oh, 100%.
I do find that very encouraging. But Ron Paul was huge for us. I mean, it was the first time that anybody who was, kind of like, I call that on the inside, because, he was in Congress and he understood it. He was saying it flat out that the Federal Reserve was an independent entity and how money was being created. And he walked people through the mechanics of it. And I know that makes people's eyes roll over. You start talking about Federal Reserve and interest rates and quantitative easing. And again, this is what I was saying at the beginning. A lot of this sort of terminology just became so convoluted.
Sure.
It's hard to understand it in everyday language, what we're really talking about anymore. So I've been trying to boil it down to the basics. And for me, after now 40 years of being in this business, it still comes down to me the simplicity of how much money is there in the world and how much of it is being absorbed by the economy. The difference between the two is an increasing in costs to the average American. And look how we experienced inflation over the past few years. It, caught up. It became the political issue. And in everything I've been reading since the election results, it was the fact that the Democrats didn't seem to get the gap between what they were saying, how well the economy was doing, and what people were actually experiencing in their day-to-day life.
Right.
And I think that gap really created a big problem for the Democrats. And I know that, I don't know how your listening audience skews. I mean, look, half the population voted Democrat and a little more than half voted Republican. So we know a lot of people were behind the Republican platform. But I think people are beginning to recognize that, we were looking at two different things. There's things that they tell us, and there's things we experience in the real world. And for me, I almost like the fact that inflation got really bad for a while.
Agreed.
Because I think people needed to be able to say, okay, we can't deny this anymore, so let's stop kidding ourselves and face the reality.
It's true.
For me, it's a little more troubling, when it's a little more subtle. And, they'll tell us we have a 2.3% inflation rate. Well, does that relate to you?
No, you know what relates? Your groceries doubled in price. That's what relates.
Yeah. And it's hard to not see that, right?
Right.
There was that point about a year and a half ago, it wasn't even that long ago, maybe about a year. We had so many people telling us that it was the same bag of food week after week, and every week the cost was going up. I mean, identical bag of food is the same supermarket, but every week the cost was going up. You couldn't ignore that sort of stuff. And that comes from this massive increase in the amount of money that we're printing, because the government has accumulated so much debt from a variety of issues and sources that even the interest payments now have become a real big problem, but they've been printing their way out of all their troubles for the past few years. I sent you that graph. I don't know if we can pull it up.
We'll bring it up.
The Federal Reserve's economic data, which is FRED.
I for a second, I was like, is this Fred's website?
Yeah. This is not me. So when it says FRED, I want you to know this comes from the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. This is the actual government data. And that graph you're looking at is the amount of money that exists and how it has been increasing. And what surprises me, or what I think people need to note, is the gap between how long it took to go up, let's say, the first $4 or $5 trillion, how many decades it took for that increase to happen. And then 17 years later, you see another 5 trillion in increase.
Yep.
And then only 6.5 years after that, another 5 trillion increase. And then look at the last 2 years.
That's insane.
Whopping 5 trillion increase, $5 trillion increase in money supply in only 2 years. So from taking 25, 30 years down to 17, down to 7, now we're down to 2 years. What I'm looking at here is a chart that's almost beginning to go parabolic. So the amount of time that has to pass is so narrow for the amount of money expansion increase that the rate that this problem is happening, it's so dramatically accelerated. I began to say to myself, okay, where is this going to show up? I mean, how are people going to experience this? Because you just can't do this.
Right. And what does M2 money supply mean for anybody out there who's...
Well, yeah, so they break the money supply. They used to calculate it into a variety of groupings. So they would say M1 was all the liquidity, like checking accounts, savings account, cash. M2 included short-term things, so things that were immediately liquid. And then you had the M3, which was the long-term money, and that would include things like government bonds that effectively are debt instruments but not payable for 10, 20, 30 years.
So this M2 is literally, essentially, I mean, it sounds like it's money in the system that we're using on a daily basis, basically.
Yeah. Readily active money and readily accessible money. In other words, you don't have to convert something first. This is cash readily available.
Okay.
And this increase has been so overwhelmingly dramatic. And I've made a point of the fact that we're talking trillions now, not billions. And I think I sometimes have to find myself going back to talking about the simplicity of how much a difference there is between that. So my favorite analogy now is I'm about 6'3". I'm a billion, let's say. If I were a trillion, I would be a 6,000 foot tall man. So, you know what I mean?
Gives you perspective on how much we're talking about.
Yeah. So we're increasing the money supply. Now, what is this going to do for average Americans? Well, you know, we have our new president, and he's got a lot of plans to move the economy forward. And a lot of these things are really positive, and I think they're going to help stimulate the economy. But economic stimulus can come from a number of different ways. I mean, we can grow an economy. If we have really good government, it'll try not to intervene with the average business person's day-to-day working life. They'll try to stay out of it. Regulations will be lower. If you have over-regulation, what happens is you and I get stuck in the mud, having to follow rules and all these things, and it really slows down our business. So the idea is that laissez-faire, you know, leave me alone, hands-off kind of government is promoting business. And growth could happen in an economy like that. Low interest rates could do the same thing. And this is the game that the Fed plays. So, you know, I want you to have great activity in your economy. I've got to make money available to you cheap. Because if it costs you a ton of money to borrow, you're going to hesitate. You're going to be hesitant to borrow it because it's going to be overwhelmingly expensive.
Right.
So we can stimulate the economy. Now, one of the ways the government does it is also government spending. Now, sometimes that can help because they can really jumpstart an economy by, let's say they come in and say in Florida, you guys need billions and billions of infrastructure. So we will promote a big government program that'll fund all that. So we're going to create all these jobs and we're going to explode.
We are building like crazy down here, like everywhere.
Isn't that great? Though?
Not just houses, but like manufacturing, warehouses, like it's everywhere, Fred.
Now, is it private or is it government?
It looks mostly private, but we also just had the entire I-4 corridor redone over the last probably 5 to 10 years. So I know that was obviously public money, but this is it's kind of a combination, but we're definitely skyrocketing in private right now. I can tell.
And this is great, right? So this helps because first of all, you get something out of it.
Right.
You get all that infrastructure built. Now, if it comes from the government, the problem is that we're basically borrowing the money to make these things happen.
And that goes to a bond, correct?
Pardon me?
Is that part of the bond right there when it goes?
It
when we're borrowing? Okay.
Or sometimes it's just the government, Congress saying, you know, we are going to create X amount of dollars and make it available so that this infrastructure can take place. Sometimes the government bonds these things. Now, I think that's the way to do it, is to bond each individual project. They don't generally do that way. So let's say you needed to build a bridge and it cost $1 million. Well, you could say to the general public in that area, we're going to sell these bonds to you. And if you will give us your money today to finance this $1 million, we'll pay you 5% interest on your money. The money will be used to build the project. And then maybe we put up a toll and we can collect the revenue back. And therefore we can pay the interest and the loans back to those that funded it. That to me is a closed end, perfect situation. It doesn't inflate the value of money, and
Right.
it ends up building something real and tangible. But most of the time, the government doesn't do things that way. They float bonds, and they don't pay them off in the end. They just roll them over.
Shocking.
And we're in a kind of strange situation now because the past few years, when the government runs big debts, in other words, spends a lot it doesn't take in, and it brings in the revenue from you and I in taxes and from the tariffs, whatever else it does. But if it doesn't bring in enough and it has to make up the gap, it'll sell a lot more debt to cover the difference. But it has to find buyers. And if there's no buyers, those things usually end up being bought by the Federal Reserve. And then the Federal Reserve builds up this balance sheet of all the stuff that it's carrying in debt. It eventually has to unwind that. And a lot of times the government has been borrowing money, especially the past few years, but they did it like 2 years ago when the rates were really, really low.
Right.
So the cost to borrow that money was like 2% or 1%. But now rates are higher. The 10-year bond is about 4.7. So that means that all the costs of borrowing money now are going up. And all that debt we borrowed 2 years ago that's now coming due, not only does it have to be paid for, so we have to create the money if we don't have it, but we also now have to pay higher interest on any future borrowing. So I think the government's going to be facing some interesting problems going forward.
Well, and you have other countries who possibly take bonds, but there was even rumblings of other countries not wanting to do that anymore. But then how much can the Fed sit there and hold? I mean, I understand the Fed is this all-powerful banking system, but at the same time, if it's just a Ponzi scheme, at some point this has to break, right? I mean, at some point, and there was talks of, in the last 2 years of BRICS, like the de-dollarization. Some people swear that will never happen, and other people are like, wait a second, they're already doing it. And if they do, we're we're literally screwed because all that money goes flowing back in. Is that not at some point, I always ask you this question. I don't know if it'll ever happen, but doesn't the system break at some point?
Well, I think hyperinflation would be the break, so that's how we would experience a crack. And you've hit on a lot of really good points there. And so it follows that if the Fed ends up building its balance sheet, why is that a problem? Well, the problem is that the Fed then is competing and owning all the debt, which means that it's the only buyer. That's not a good way to support your economy. So the Fed's balance sheet exploded after 2020. It ended up at one point with over $9 trillion worth of crap, effectively, debt on its balance sheet. And as it tried to unwind it, it was competing with the rest of the market, and it created an interest rate problem. So it begins to compete and it squeezes the markets, and that means interest rates are going up. So the Fed has to try to do this slowly, but it's hard to unwind trillions of dollars over any short period of time without having an impact. So the Fed is still holding debt from 2008. I know we've talked about this before, but when they had to bail out all the mortgage-backed securities,
it's still holding from 2008?
Yes, they still have over $4 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities from 2008, about 1.7 trillion. And you've talked about other countries that buy U.S. debt. So China at one point had, I think at the peak, $1.7 trillion worth of U.S. debt. They have sold 700 billion of that in the last 15 months. So they've gone from 1.7 trillion down to about $1 trillion, and they've liquidated about 700 billion of their bond holdings. They're not as aggressive an accumulator as they used to be. So now we have to find others who want U.S. government debt. And now you talk about BRICS. Okay, so now here you have a group of countries who said, listen, we've been obligated since World War II to pretty much support the U.S., but we're kind of getting tired of it. And if you're not going to put the gun to our head and force us to do it, well, maybe we start looking for another option. Is there anything else out there that we can do That doesn't force us to have to work with the West. And if we use the US dollar as a weapon, like we're doing in Ukraine against Putin, we lock him out of the SWIFT banking system, for example. So, in other words, we're weaponizing the US dollar. We're using our power with the US dollar to affect political change. Other countries look at that and say, well, what if the US gets aggravated at us? And they use this same kind of weaponization against us. Is there anything we can do? And so they look for options. And BRICS comes along and says, well, maybe we'll set up our own group. And we'll support each other, and we can conduct commerce between each other. We don't need the West.
And no one takes them serious to begin with, and then all of a sudden they become very serious.
The more countries that start getting involved, the more it's harder to ignore it.
Right.
So it's grown dramatically. From originally 5 or 6 countries, you're up to about 18 participants. And the number is growing all the time. And, granted, some of these are small countries. They don't amount to much in the world's economy. The idea that we're seeing more and more people align themselves this way, it alludes to the idea that many people are thinking maybe outside the box and saying, well, just because this is the old world way of doing things, and this is the established rules since, World War II, we don't have to follow that. We're going to make our own rules. And they create their own system to conduct commerce amongst each other. And suddenly the West is cut out. So where's the demand then for the US dollar? If these other countries don't have to buy it, we have to compete with it in order to make it attractive. And you can only do that by making your interest rates, aggressive. But the problem is, if you raise your rates to make your dollar more attractive, you end up slowing your own economy down. And the Fed is worried about a recession. If they're afraid that if they keep the economy too tight, they're going to send the economy spinning into a recession. So they're trying to find this magic balance point, that can we just keep rates low enough to keep the economy moving forward, not add too much to the debt, but somehow not put the economy in a recession. So the Fed's going to meet at 2 o'clock today, Eastern time. And the consensus is we'll see probably a 1/4 point drop. Everybody was, and again, I was pushing against the wind all year, but in January, everybody said, we're going to have 4 rate drops and it's going to start in spring. And I'm sitting there going, if that is the way things go, my understanding of what's happening is a little flawed because I can't see how that's going to work. And here we are now. It's November. We've had 1 instead of 4 rate drops. And we might get this one today problematically. And okay, so we'll end up with 2. I doubt there'll be another one before the end of the year. So, the Fed is again facing this sort of funky problem. Can we pull this magic trick off of, keeping the rates low? So I really worry about de-dollarization because, when the dollar was backed by gold and silver, it was a standard. I mean, it was a real thing. And people could say, I could support that. I could buy dollars. They're convertible into gold or silver. And, that's a great way for me to do this. A lot of times countries will look to other currencies when they are worried. So let's say, you're China and you're uncomfortable. Well, maybe you'll start investing in another country's currency. But when all the countries around the world are inflating their money, there's really no safe haven there anymore. So just switching from one country's currency to another, you're not getting anywhere. So by default, the central banks around the world, they've been buying gold. And in a massive amount. They have increased their positions so much so that the demand has accelerated. So between all this paper money we showed in that graph and how fast it's been printed and this accumulation that's been going on by the central banks, the price of gold has gone up dramatically. We've had about a 35% increase this year in the price of an ounce of gold. And that is a phenomenal thing because, again, you have to understand how much they try to keep that from happening. They want to suppress and silver because they don't want you and I to look at it and say, there must be a problem with the dollar if the price of gold's going through the roof. Why would gold be going up if the dollar was strong? If the dollar was keeping its relative value, that ounce of gold should cost me the same as it did 5 years ago. But there's no way that can happen when the increasing money supply has exploded by trillions in just a couple of years. And what do you think we're going to be looking at in the next 3 to 5 years? I've been saying this since I was on Patrick's show. I'm talking about a $50 trillion national debt before the year 2030. So at one point I had said this was going to take 10 years. About 3.5 years has passed since the first time I said that. And the rate at which they've done this has actually picked up pace. So now I'm down to, we're in 2024. I think within the next 5 years, by 2029, certainly before 2030, where we are 35 trillion now in debt, we'll be at 50. And the only reason that matters is because the interest payments at 50 trillion be incredibly difficult for the government to manage, which means they're either going to have to raise our taxes, somehow raise this kind of revenue, somehow slow down the government deficit spending, or option three, we can print our way out of the problem. What do you think they're going to pick as the option?
Well,
let's take a poll. What do people think out of the three options? One, raise taxes to the roof, right? Number two, somehow convince the government to start spending less than it's spending. Or three, just print your way out of the problem.
Give me 1, 2, or 3 in the comments. 1, 2, or 3. 2 is responsibility. 3 is morons still running government and printing. And number 1 was, what was 1?
1 is you raise taxes.
Raise taxes, which Democrats love that typically. Well, so do rhinos, so it doesn't really matter. But pick one of those, and I'll let Fred know what the most popular number is. Now, what about, what's that?
I'd be curious what the number is. So now imagine that the president comes in and says instead of raising taxes, he's going to lower taxes because he wants to help people. Okay, well, what's going to happen to the deficit? It's going to go up like crazy. So there'll be a short-term positive, economic impact by the lowering of taxes, but it also adds to the debt. So sometimes you have to sort of find this, you're a politician, you got to find a political balance. Can you do something today that helps people and not worry about what happens in 5 years? That again is problematic.
We have a smart crowd. They have picked number 3. Overwhelming. Number 3. Now the other one is someone said tariffs. President Trump has said tariffs. Is that going to help?
Yeah.
Do you, in your, like, he's offered a lot of, like, no taxing tips, getting rid of the federal income tax, tariffs. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as a president just trying to get elected? Do you see these as actual solutions?
Well, tariffs will help in a couple of fashions of things that we have an economic problem with, which is our trade imbalances. And the idea is really pro-American, which I've got to get behind that concept, right? Which is, if China is able to sell its, let's say, less quality products to us in America and not have to pay an awful lot to do so, and then it makes it harder for American manufacturers to sell the same kind of products around the world because China is able to do it cheaper, then yes, applying a tariff to them would help. The problem, though, is that it is inflationary because, a tariff is going to generally raise the cost of those products to us. And some people do take advantage of these cheaper, foreign products. We all do it, whether we recognize it or not. We sometimes look at two things, and one's, made in America, and the other one I can buy from, and it's half the price. Well, it might just be good enough for what I need, and I buy that cheaper product.
Right.
Now, if the tariffs are raised and those things get a little more equal, then it becomes less of a gap. But that does mean the cost of that cheaper product is probably going to go up. So these things have dual-edged swords, and there's no political option here that doesn't have a downside. Right. Everything has a cost, right, and a benefit, and you just have to sort of figure out, can you pick the ones that are going to be the most beneficial with the least detrimental effects in the long term? I don't think there's any political options left for any president. And I've said this, I believe that since Ronald Reagan, we've lost the possibility of politically changing the direction that we are going to be heading. I don't see any way that we don't increase the rate of debt and deficits over the next 5 years at a faster pace than what we've seen before. And again, if you think about that chart, if we increase the rate at which we're printing money from what we've done the past 2 years, this increase is going to cause the price of gold to skyrocket more from here.
Yep.
The price of silver to skyrocket, the cost that we're buying to increase again. We're going to experience this inflation. And I know they talk about the Fed has gained ground in the fight against inflation, and this is true, but we need to sort of split this hair and recognize what they're talking about is slowing down the rate that inflation is increasing. So we're not talking about reducing inflation. We're talking about reducing the rate at which it's growing. And those are two completely different things.
They're very different things.
I don't, people shouldn't get lured, into the sense of security by all the wonderful sounding rhetoric coming out of the Fed about how they're winning the battle against inflation. I'm not buying it. And I also, unfortunately, believe that, no matter how people thought about the election, now that we know where we are, I hope people are not expecting the government to take care of them. I've kind of come back to this idea, and Ron Paul talked about this, the idea that individually we have a responsibility. Ben Franklin was quoted as saying, somebody asked him, what kind of government have you guys created?
Yep.
And he said, it's a republic as long as you can keep it.
That's right.
That was the key phrase. So what does that mean? It means that individually we have to accept responsibility as Americans. There are things we need to do. And one of those is, I'm afraid to say, you can't bury your head in the sand and just expect that the government now is just going to do everything wonderfully and perfect and everything's going to work well and your future's guaranteed and you don't have to worry about the value of your money. I'm sorry, that's just not the real world we live in. People need to recognize there is a real problem with our system. It's not going away, but there is wealth protection available in the original form of sound money. And it was the reason the Founding Fathers had created sound money as our system in the beginning. And this is what I was saying before, where I go back and I relearn history, and I look at current things, and I go back and go, boy, these guys had it right from the start, didn't
they? They kind of knew what they were talking about, didn't they? So Judy Shelton, you know that name, right?
I do.
She was the nominee for Fed chairman under Trump. She did not get in, but she keeps talking about golden age and gold standard. And she actually, about a year or so ago, I think it was, someone on X, Twitter, someone said something about a gold standard 2026, something like that. And she said, sounds good, 2026. And I was like, I'd have to go find the actual post, but she's also today, there's an article she posted today about returning to this golden standard age of money. And she keeps putting out information about that. And I don't know her, but between her talking about it, Trump talking about it, he's a well-known gold bug. Any chance ever? I mean, he's talking about getting rid of the debt with Bitcoin. I mean, he's been talking a big game, Fred.
Yep. And a lot of this is interesting, and we'll have to see how it all plays out. The reason I think the likelihood of a return to a gold standard is extremely problematically low is because I don't think the government could control itself under those constraints. Okay. I just don't think they could do it, right? So if we had a gold standard, that would immediately eliminate their ability to just print their way out of their problems. So we're going to take our three options, right? We're going to take printing off the table because now we have real sound money. Well, then how do we address the debt? We only have the other two options. One, raise taxes, or two, somehow reduce government spending. I just don't think we have a Congress or government ever that's going to be able to manage being locked down to only being able to spend what they really bring in. I don't see it likely, especially when the carrying cost of the debt is going to be so large going forward that even that alone is going to create the need to raise so much money that I don't think we can lock down a gold standard and survive the onslaught of the amount of we have to come up with over the next several years with the debt rolling over. So I would love to see it. Nothing would make me happier. I always say that I feel like the cop who, they talk about what would you do if there was no crime? He said, well, I'd be thrilled that I won't have to do my job anymore, that's no longer an issue. Right. And I feel the same way that, if we really had a gold standard, I wouldn't feel as compelled as I was to, be involved as a gold numismatic dealer. I'd say, well, we have an option. We have good sound money. It's not as that. It would just be back to hey, there's a lot of fun in collecting coins.
Yeah. She posted. She posted a letter from Nixon to her 30 years ago. And then this person says, in 71, he abolished the gold standard. Should we reintroduce it in 2024? She posted thinking something like that, but in 2026, stay tuned.
Well, I'm fascinated by what that would mean,
And then today, she keeps posting. This was her post today. The new golden age of America.
Okay.
Now she's not in position of anything, but she was his nominee, and she's obviously very, very well known and considered a star in the finance world, obviously.
No doubt, very bright. So
there you go, Fred. I don't know. I'm hoping for the best, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I would love to see it, and I would be the ultimate supporter for it. I would be out there on the mountaintop screaming my head off for everybody to get behind this, right? I would like to see the mechanics of how this would work, because that's the thing that I'm stumbling on, is I just don't functionally see how it would happen. But at some point, if you started that, first of all, it would be obviously quite beneficial for anybody holding gold or silver. So for those thinking about what that would mean, if we did attach a standard to the dollar, that would mean an accumulation of gold would have to continue to happen, which would definitely increase its price. By the way, one other thing I just wanted to mention before I forget, there's been a really interesting thing with the gold and silver prices. As the prices of the metals have been increasing, we've had a premium contraction. So at one point, the prices to buy pre-64 silver coins had it grown to a point where we were averaging about $8.50 over the spot price per ounce for any silver coin. And that's just where we were. That was our cost basis. So, a 50-cent piece, which is roughly a half ounce, more than about $4.25, $4.50 in its price, merely was the premium that we were paying over melt. Well, as the price of silver has been increasing so fast, it's forced the dealers to reduce the premiums on the most common gold and standard silver coins. We've gone from $8.50. At one point, we hit a low of about 20 cents over spot. And currently, we're at about 50, 60 cents. We've had the first increase again in the last month. It just happened this week because the price of silver dipped a little bit. So what's happened is it's almost as if you could buy silver coins today for the same price you would have paid when silver was $28 an ounce, even though it's like $32 an ounce right now, because the premium over melt has been compressed. This is a very unusual thing.
Why is that?
Well, I think what happens is when the price of gold and silver go up really fast, the market doesn't have time to adjust. And a lot of people take short-term profits, especially these traders who come in and out. So if they bought a whole pile of gold or silver, and then there's this really rapid increase, well, they turn around and they dump it. So the dealers are overwhelmed with sellers in such a short amount of time that they just get bombarded with inventory to the point where they have to start reducing what they're paying, but they can't change the base metal price. The only thing they have to work with is the premium. Okay. So they try to compress it to a point. And then as the price of silver begins to slow down a little bit, the premium begins to expand again. It's just a really weird quirk of things that have happened. It's the first time in 40 years I've ever seen it. My point being, it has created kind of an opportunity for anybody who may have missed getting in before now. They still have a really good chance to get in and effectively save a couple of dollars by getting in with lower premiums. And again, I think these premiums will re-expand as things settle down. It's just because the rate silver and gold have gone up. I mean, 35% increase in gold in a year is, at silver, it's over 40%. That's just massive. So the market has to keep up with that.
Did you ever expect that to happen? I mean, obviously you watched how they were spending money out there and the Fed and everything, but did you expect it? Do you expect the last year or two to be like it was ever?
Not this fast. Okay. I knew there had to be an impact because, again, I've come back to the simple basics of just calculating it all based on that money supply. That's all I'm looking at. There are dozens of variables that you could pay attention to that economists could pick apart, and they're going to be right. But to me, the big picture always comes down to, if you want to make it as simple as possible, we just need to look at how much money there is in the world. If that amount is expanding and the economy is not absorbing it, well, that gap is going to be showing up somewhere in higher prices. So I knew this had to happen, but the pace that it happened even caught me by surprise. But I also have looked at it go in the next 5 years. This is going to look cheap. I hate to say this. The current prices for gold and silver 5 years from now are going to look incredibly cheap because I think this problem is really accelerating rapidly. I think that chart is going to look ridiculous in less than 3 to 5 years from now.
Does the value of gold and silver going up, is that ever directly connected or correlated to having to back the currencies, or are they just totally different things? Like as gold goes up and silver goes up, does it become like, hey, we have to back the dollar because it's so out of control at this point and those values are going up? Or are those just two different total subjects?
They really are. So in the end, there's about 4 variables that account for everyday prices for gold and silver. There's the manufacturing and how much they're producing. There's the industrial demand, which is all the stuff that gold and silver are used for, and all the goals, right? You've got central bank purchasing, and then you've got individual investors. And these 4 things together account for the daily price. So any one of those that changes will change its price. That's just why, for example, it's the central banks as one of those 4 variables. They've been aggressively accumulating gold, pushing up the price. Industrial demand has been huge.
That's the other one. I mean, between EVs and new computers and stuff, I mean, there's no way this doesn't skyrocket, right?
And the only recovery for jewelry, comes from like the old scraps of jewelry that people have, like a broken necklace where they have that refined, that metal gets purified and comes back into the market. That only accounts for a small percentage of the amount of new gold coming into play. The rest of it has to come from mining. And the mining operators keep saying that they call it the easy gold has been mined. In other words, the more expensive it is to mine gold, the more the price has to go up. And when you first start a mining operation, you find the stuff readily available, but then you have to start digging deeper and it gets more expensive. You have to go to more remote locations. Now they're all over the world looking for gold, right? They're digging in the oceans. They're looking everywhere for it. Where can we find more gold deposits? But it's getting a lot more expensive to produce it, and that's a big part of its price. So all these things come into play. Now, again, if let's say the government comes out and says something like Judy Sheldon's idea, as of this date, we're going to have some sort of quantity of gold, against the U.S. dollar. Okay, well, let's say you take all the dollars that currently exist. There's 21.2 trillion worth of paper dollars floating around in the world today. If you divided that by all the gold ever mined in the world, the number that would reduce gold's price per ounce would approach about $50,000 an ounce for gold. That's the gap between the amount of money.
I'm all about it. Let's go. I got enough here. Let's.
Right. So for me, I'm just accumulating, and I know a lot of people are sitting on an awful lot of money around the United States. It's about $3.4 trillion sitting in the banks, because people are scratching their heads, going, "Well, I think the volatility in the stock market scares me," and some people are just saying they don't understand it, and a lot of people don't understand even gold and silver these days, and I get that. So. We hope that people will feel encouraged to ask questions, because we want to provide people with a resource and they can say, okay, I think I get it, but I've got questions and I don't want to feel like I don't know enough to move forward. So I need a resource to at least figure this stuff out and get a handle on what's going on. And, I've been working with the people that have been with us here. There is nobody who's working within my company now that has not been with us for less than 25 years. So our staff is prepared to help people answer the basics and the questions. And I think that is critical in this sort of economic world where there's so much gobbledygook. There's just a plethora of terminology and nonsense that makes people's eyes glaze over. So we're going to be here to provide that resource for people who like to ask questions. I have a toll-free number. It's 800-878-COIN. Call us anytime. We'll answer whatever questions you have.
Wait, it's 800-878-COIN? It actually is coin?
It is.
Good job on that.
Thanks.
I love that. I love it. And so I want to do a special, I want to do this for Fred, for anybody, because there's a lot more new people coming on, especially since the election. Go over to the podcast. So if you click on here, upper right, it says podcast. It'll bring up this new site here. And he goes, it's Fred Talk, which is fantastic, brilliant marketing. Price of gold, dollarization. There are a lot of people out there, everybody, who talk about IRAs. They talk about putting your money in certain accounts and gold and paper gold and silver paper. And so my relationship with Fred goes back to Fred's probably about 5 years ago. I found Fred's original partner, who's passed away, Andy, well over a decade ago, on a podcast that I used to listen to before I was doing a podcast, right? And it was a natural health podcast. And I would listen to Andy, and I honestly, like, I would go find all his episodes because it was so compelling. He was such a great speaker. And I would listen, and I'm like, wow, this makes sense. And then, Fred jumps in to take over after that. Fred is not one of those people who comes on and pushes like, oh, do an IRA or Noble Gold. And I'm not saying anything's wrong with those places. I'm not judging them. I've only picked Fred because, one, he's a great guy, good friend. We text back and forth, but they started my journey in this world. And I believe you need to know something about the history of money. And a lot of people out there who are pushing, whether it's IRAs or gold or silver or whatever they do push out there, what is their basis? Where are they coming from? What is their history, their knowledge? Are they constitutional money people? Fred is a constitutional money person. Like he goes back to the foundation and foundational principles of how money works. And that's why I bring him forward, because I believe you have to be able to trust people. And as many people out there probably in the comments will say who worked with Fred, whether they talk to Fred, they talk to Don or whoever else, they literally feel when they call like they're a friend and family member of the business, because you guys take time to talk to them and help them understand. And sometimes it's not right for the person to jump in. Maybe they don't have the availability or the means to do that. And then sometimes it is absolutely right. So everyone I've ever talked to who talked to you, Fred, or Don, or anybody else, rave reviews.
Great. I appreciate that. And again, I can't tell you how much business I have turned down this year because people were approaching it from what I believe to be fundamentally the wrong way to look at it. I've had people who have had, responses to something they've seen on the internet. And, we know the internet as a world has got, talk about your dual-edged swords. Number one, you've got access to all the information that, the world has accumulated since Mesopotamia, at your disposal. But with that comes an awful lot of crap that, you have to get through. And isn't it getting harder to distinguish the bullshit from the truth? The line has gotten a little more, and the more sophisticated we've gotten in technology, the harder it is to separate that. So, I find that all compelling. But with all this research, I've had people who've called up in a panic mode about something they saw, that, the price of gold is going to $500 an ounce next week, and they want to buy $100,000 worth of gold today because they think by next Tuesday. And I have turned down millions and millions in business this year from people.
Are they just trying to turn around the $400 profit or something crazy like that? Like, that's insane.
They thought there was going to be a huge quick gain. They would make a big pile of money. They'd come in, they'd come out. And I will not do those trades. Number one, because I don't think that's the right way to do this. I think this is about wealth protection. It's kind of like, I always think about it the same way when I have to write that check every year. Down here in South Carolina, we have wind and hail and flood insurance because we're in a hurricane zone. And the island that I live on, the highest point above sea level is literally 35 feet. That's our high point. So we're in a flood zone. We have to pay this flood insurance, and it's a big premium we have to pay every year. But I do that because I think about my home and I think about protecting its value. I don't like having to do it, but I get the reality as an adult that this is something, I can't ignore, got to do it. I think of gold and silver in the same way, that it's an unfortunate, necessary thing that people should do because we unfortunately can't count on the government to provide us with that gold standard until Judy gets what she wants, Until that happens and we don't have that standard, we can't rely on the government to do this properly and take care of us or not do the things they're going to do. Knowing that personal responsibility that Ron Paul used to talk about, this is where that kicks in. So I believe people need to own physical gold and silver in their possession for exactly that reason. And that's why I shy away from the speculators, because I don't think that's the right rationale. And then, of course, what happens is these events don't happen. And, you have somebody who put a lot of money in the market. A week later, they don't get what they expected to happen. And now there's no gain. Nothing happened. They probably lost money because of the costs coming in and out. So that doesn't make any sense to me. So I think people need to look at this properly. But yeah, it's been really interesting. And I do think that somehow people like you are so critical now, because we need this, my friend refers to it as critical thinking. We need to educate people on how to separate understanding something that's real and true from things that are just hype and hyperbole and are not founded. And just because it's repeated 5 or 6 times doesn't make it any more true. The same story repeated over and over by, you watch the media these days, and I started looking at this years ago. I know that like Jon Stewart makes a joke of this constantly on things like The Daily Show, where they take clips and they show 11 people on this different stations saying the same phrase over and over again all day long. I'm like, well, how did that happen? Well, obviously somebody decided that this was whatever they're going to promote today, and everybody's going to say the same thing. Well, because it gets repeated, did that make it any more true than it was the first time it was said? It doesn't. But this is the kind of thing that gets harder for people to separate. And so I get it that people are having a harder time these days. You can't even look at a picture anymore and know, is that a real picture? Is it AI? Is this like, are you really there right now, Jason? Am I talking to you? Can you prove that you're there?
So it happens. It happens in healthcare too, in the natural world. And I have a buddy who comes on usually on Mondays to talk about stuff, and he's like, it's a good and bad thing with these short, like 1 minute, 2 minute reels, because great, it's getting information out there, but at the same time, Fred, according to the reels, gold and silver are going to go to insane amounts of money overnight, and also baking soda cures everything. And I have people that come to me and go, why can't I just do that? And I go, that's not how it works. Like, just because someone said it in a 1 minute reel got 2.5 million views doesn't make something fully true. And I fully understand where you're coming from.
So how do we do this? How do we educate people to start to separate the plethora of information out there and filter what's right? I don't know any other way but to kind of, I think you said this at the very beginning of the show, you've got to educate yourselves a little bit and, be willing to do a little homework. There still are some great books out there that really built the foundation for this. I still have people who haven't quite grasped the idea that the Federal Reserve isn't part of the government. I mean, I can't believe that we get pushback on that.
It's called federal.
70s, we've had that evidence that's been available for that. And, it's just disheartening to me that that's still a question in people's mind. But again, it's been a whole nother generation since this information first came out, right? There are people who don't know who Ron Paul ever was. So we've got to go back. Fill it in. We've got to continue to try to help people recognize there is truth out there, and it does, sometimes take a little digging, or you have to find somebody that you can rely on, So I find myself in that position these days. Like, everything that I face that's new to me, I figure it as one of two choices. Either one, I got to get up to speed and become an expert at this subject, or I've got to find somebody I can rely on. So if I'm in your world, I don't know a damn thing about the health world enough to be able to say anything to anybody that's going to be helpful.
Right.
But if I have a problem, I know I have a resource and I can say, hey, does this really work? Is this beneficial? Is this something that makes any sense? Or is this just one of those things? And I'm going to rely on that expertise because, the only other choice is you have to try to become proficient at every single thing. How do you do that?
You don't. So, how did you feel about Ron Paul and Elon Musk chit-chatting back and forth about government efficiency department?
That is amazing. I would have loved to have been up. All right. And what a missed opportunity. I should have seen this coming. I should have bought Tesla stock knowing between Trump and Elon Musk all of a sudden. Like, when did those guys become such great buddy? But okay. All right. And meanwhile, look at what happens, So, yeah, a Ron Paul and Elon Musk conversation. Wow.
Right. How crazy it is! He's almost 90 years old, and I mean, it's almost like he's becoming popular again at 90. That's so crazy that we've come into this world.
I really do. But I do encourage people, pull up clips from, I think the 90s is about when he really got into his groove.
Oh yeah.
Because for a while, you remember, I think you probably do. I mean, everybody dismissed him as an idiot. They just said he's a lunatic.
I thought he was a lunatic when I first saw him too.
All the congressmen would roll their eyes when he got up to talk. The Federal Reserve chairmen would be like, "Oh crap, it's that Ron Paul guy. Here we go again." But after a while, he didn't give up. He just stuck to his guns and kept repeating them. And as it got out, it got harder to dismiss. Because remember in the early 80s and 90s, you didn't have the YouTube stuff to repeat this stuff.
Right.
It aired. If you weren't watching CNN, and who the hell watched the C-SPAN and CNN congressional hearings with the Federal Reserve Chairman? Who sat through that? Nobody did. So you only got secondhand information about what happened, and nobody really reported on Ron Paul. But little by little, these clips started coming out, and little videos would be said. Somebody would post it, and the next thing you know, it'd be like, "Oh my God, here's a guy espousing the truth who seems to really understand it. What's going to happen? How is this going to jive with what they're telling people, and how are they going to deal with this guy?" I kept waiting for him to be assassinated. I kept figuring, there's no way this guy survives.
No way.
Controversial. But here he is, 90 years old. Still.
There's even clips out there now of people that are like the Mises Institute people, like old school people, and I look at them like that. Where is that video even from? That's so old, and people are pulling this stuff out of who knows where. From 70s. I mean, it's insane. I'm like, wow, this is that. And the views keep up, and you're like, wow, people are actually getting it. There's some clips now of younger like men and women in their probably early 20s who will sit there just at a TikTok video, Fred. They'll sit there for a minute, and they'll be like, wait, I got a paycheck that got taxed, and then I went to the store and I had to pay tax on something, but then I had to go to pay taxes. And after 30 seconds of them saying tax over and over in their head to themselves, they had this mind-blowing moment on camera, and all the comments are like, yes, you finally get it. The money system is messed. Like, that's the realizations people are having. And it's so strange to watch, but it's actually amazing too.
Yep. A lot of the stuff is coming around again. It's what's old is new again. But I'm glad people are catching on. I mean, I've seen 100 new videos about the basics of fractional banking. So you deposit $10,000 in the bank, and the bank loans out $9,000 of that. They keep 10%, and that $9,000 loan goes to somebody else who uses it to buy a car, and he pays the guy. The guy takes your $9,000, and he deposits it in his bank, and it's counted a second time. And then that bank takes $9,000 and loans $8,100 out of it, and they do this so on and so on. So that bridge of $10,000 becomes $100,000, and this is how money is expanded into the system. And people are sort of like, "Oh my God, is that what they're really doing?" And I'm like, "Yep." It's been going on like that that's basically what fractional banking means. This is how we operate. So when you think that there's money sitting in the bank, it really isn't there. It's been loaned out. And we have to hope that the whole game of, chairs, like the music doesn't stop playing, because at some point, if it does, we see what happens. When 2008 came around, we got a rude awakening to what happens when the game stops. But imagine what'll happen in the next round if they screw up again. I mean, $1 trillion won't do it like it did in 2008. That's not going to do it. And again, I keep reminding people, we're still paying for that. We're still paying for it.
That's crazy. USCoinCapital.com, CAPITOL.com. Lots of good stuff going on over there.
Absolutely, yeah. We've been seeing just this huge number of people that are really coming around on their own to sort of questioning everything. And I find that very encouraging. So anybody who has any questions, again, don't hesitate to give us a call.
They're so pretty. Look at those. They're so pretty, Fred. Like, oh my gosh, look at the color. It's so amazing, isn't it?
It is. Gold is a beautiful metal. It really is.
Really is a pretty metal. Absolutely.
So I've got a couple of silver dollar deals. For the holidays, I always try to put stuff together. So if anybody's interested in something kind of fun for the holidays, those silver dollars you're looking at right now, the Morgans, I've got a bunch of those that are NGC graded. So each one is sealed, certified, Mint State 63, 20 of them come in what we call a row box. That's those NGC boxes with the slots. 20 coins fit in a box, so it's a very light, portable thing. And it's 20 coins for $1,350, which is $67.50 a coin. The metal alone, comprises about half of that. It costs almost $30 to grade a coin, and these are mint condition, 100-year-old silver dollars.
Wow.
So I've got a number of these available, and a lot of people have been giving away as for holiday gifts. But anyway, just something I figured I'd throw out there if anybody wants to look for something, just different to give away for the holidays, something real. And the responses we've gotten from people who did this over the last few years, the people that got it were just like, wow, this is just so cool. It's such an unusual kind of way to give somebody a little bit of money, which people like to do in different forms. What's better than original constitutional money?
Love it. I love it. My father-in-law, who I've been working on educating him with this. He understands money, but he was a little into the old system. He pulls out a coin the other day at dinner. He's like, hey, look what I got. And he hands me a coin like when I get one from you in the little box thing. He's like, it's a Morgan. I'm like, oh my, like he got, but the crazy part was he didn't get it from me. He's getting it from his own, like he's studying, he's looking at things, and he sees obviously the money's a mess. And I was just like, wow, they're waking up, Fred. They really are waking up. I mean, he was like bragging about his Morgan, which is pretty cool.
Well, there's nothing better than, the original money when you have it in your possession. There's something kind of comforting about the feeling of physically having it, and you kind of get it. It just sort of hits home at like, why was this originally our money system? I see it. There's that real physical asset. Because I keep telling people, if you think about what we're doing, you take out a $10 bill and it says Federal Reserve note. Why does it say that? Well, because a dollar was a defined quantity, and people sort of forget this. A dollar is like a gallon. When you go to the store, buy a gallon of something. So the gallon is a weight measured.
A measure.
Right? And a dollar is a weight measured unit. It's a dollar of something. Is it a dollar of gold? Is it a dollar of silver?
It's a great way of putting it.
Not, well, then it's a note. And a note is like an IOU. So I'm like, okay, if I write you an IOU and I said, I owe you $100, and I write an IOU on a piece of paper, and let's say you wanted to buy something for $100 from your neighbor, and you wanted to give him my IOU, you say to him, I want to pay you with Fred's IOU. Well, his question is going to be, well, who the hell is Fred? And is he going to make good on this IOU, or is this worthless? How do I know? So we all accept these Federal Reserve notes from our government. And the idea is we're accepting this because
it just looks prettier than a piece of paper. That's all, Fred.
Right. But it's printed by the government, right? Well, technically not. So, but we accept the notion that IOU we're getting presented with is good and valid. And why is that? Well, because we know in the end there is one user, and that's the Internal Revenue Service. They will take it in payment for the taxes we have to pay. So we know that in one respect, if you won't take my $20 bill, well, at least the IRS will. So there's an end user there. But if that's the only system that accounts for the validity of money, to me, I like the idea of taking my $20 bill into a bank and saying, give me the $20 worth of gold that is supposed to be represented by this note, and allow me to exchange that when I choose to. Well, then I feel a lot more comfortable paying you, discharging my debt to you with that $20 note. I've really paid you off. The IOU I presented to you is only as good as my credit, right?
Right.
So how good is the credit of the Federal Reserve or the government that's creating these notes for you, right? You've taken those notes. You're getting paid in them. You've got them in your bank account right now. It's because you believe that the government that issued it is going to stand behind it. So let's look at where they are. Okay, they're $35 trillion in debt. They added $1.8 trillion to the deficit this year. The interest payments are so large that they're having a hard time financing their interest. And yet we continue to accept this money without any kind of issue that it has validity. Why does anybody still accept that as rationale? It almost becomes interesting as a question. So conceptually, I always come back to the idea, give me that silver dollar, that Morgan. I feel a lot more comfortable with the idea that that's real money. And let me put a portion of what I'm going to save for my future in that form. I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable than, counting on these paper dollars to retain their value. I just don't trust the government to provide that protection for me. And I don't think anybody else should either.
100%. I agree. Fred Dashevsky, US Coin Capital, uscoincapital.com, and it's 1-800-878-COIN, 2646, 1-800-878-COIN. And Fred, I'm going to get you on a regular schedule. How about that?
Oh, that'd be great. Anytime.
Fantastic.
Between us, figure it out, because I know yours and mine, it's crazy, but we'll figure it out.
I love it.
Great.
I appreciate you, sir. Thank you so much for being with me today.
All right. Be well, and God bless America. And I hope everybody is optimistic about the future, but takes that personal responsibility and does what's necessary to protect themselves and get educated.
Absolutely. For Fred, I'm Dr. Dean. Love, help, and serve, as we always say. This is Brave TV. Have a great rest of your Thursday. And hey, crazy enough, tonight is Prosperity Group. We're going to talk about this, a little bit of crypto, all the good stuff behind the scenes. So we'll see you then. And for the rest of you, have an amazing day. Take care of yourselves.